Thank you, Simon. Thank you for that expert auctioneering. He really does work hard, especially at this hour. It's a real effort, and he gives 100% and has done a fantastic job. So please say thank you to Simon. Well done. And now, as they say, for something completely different. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you our Graf Orator for this year, Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi is a political philosopher and public intellectual. He's one of the Jewish world's most thoughtful and perceptive commentators. He was born and raised in Brooklyn in New York. He completed a Bachelor of Arts in Jewish Studies at Brooklyn College and a Master of Arts in Journalism at Northwestern University. In 1982, he made Aliyah, moved to Israel with his wife Sarah. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where they live, and he's a contributing editor to the New Republic. He writes regularly for leading American publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. His recent book, Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, was named Best Jewish Book of the Year by the National Jewish Book Council and has been called one of the 3 best books ever written about Israel. I've read the book. It's fantastic. I can highly recommend it. It's probably the definitive social and literary history of Israel. If you really want to understand and get into the Jewish psyche and the Jewish mind and what really goes on in the bowels of Jewish society, this is the book to read. Yossi Klein Halevi is also the author of At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, and also, in the 1980s, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. He's active in reconciliation efforts between Muslims and Jews and serves as chairman of Open House, an Arab-Jewish coexistence centre in the town of Ramleh near Tel Aviv. Tonight, he will speak to us about the delegitimisation challenge faced by Israel, something which is especially apposite in the current situation faced by Israel. Friends, please put your hands together to welcome Yossi Klein Halevi.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, friends. I'd like to first thank the wonderful staff and volunteers of the Shalom Institute for enriching Jewish life. And personally, I'd like to thank Hilton and Marilyn Immerman for your extraordinary hospitality that you've extended to Sarah and to me. I'm a long way from home at an excruciating moment, but being here with all of you has made that distance a little less formidable. Thank you. This period on the Jewish calendar is known as the 3 weeks leading up to the fast day of Tisha B'Av, commemorating the destruction of the 2 temples. And in this period, we remember the tightening Roman siege of Jerusalem. And this has indeed been a time of tightening siege in various forms for Israel and for the Jewish people worldwide. Israel is experiencing what one might call concentric circles of siege. The innermost circle is the siege against the home front. Every corner of the state of Israel is now vulnerable to missile assault, either from Hamas, from Hezbollah, farther afield from Iran. And what we've experienced in the last few weeks is that the unthinkable, or at least what was once unthinkable, has now become routine. It was once unthinkable that every corner of the state of Israel would be vulnerable to missile attack, that Tel Aviv would be repeatedly targeted, And now, of course, we are in a new reality. In fact, this new reality began in the year 2000, when the nature of the threat against Israel was transformed. In the year 2000, beginning with the suicide bombings, the Second Intifada that lasted for 4 years, the target shifted from the Israeli military to the home front. Civilians now became the front line. The distance, of course, between the home front and the battlefront in Israel was always very small. And yet what began to change in the year 2000 is that the home front became the primary target. And this then became the pattern over subsequent years. 2006, Hezbollah's war against Israel, 1 month of shelling the communities in the north. And of course, over the years, for a decade or more, the constant shelling of Jewish communities along the Gaza border. We have experienced, in effect, one long war, punctuated by ceasefires. Since the year 2000, we have been in a war against Israel's home front. The Iron Dome, as extraordinarily effective as it's been in this war, is something of an illusion. If you factor in the extent of the threat to Israel, the missile threat, the 200,000 estimated missiles that are in possession of Hezbollah, Iran, Hamas, the Iron Dome's effectiveness is severely limited. In a limited war with Hamas, the Iron Dome can protect us. But God forbid, if the war should widen, and everyone in Israel knows this war can widen, as it has in the past, the effectiveness of the Iron Dome will be severely strained. The next circle of siege is the circle around Israel's borders. And here, really for the first time in the history of this conflict over the last years, we have seen terror enclaves taking root along almost every one of our borders. Hamas, Hezbollah, now we have Al-Qaeda, literally Al-Qaeda, on our border with the Golan and emerging to one extent or another in Sinai. The Gaza terror enclave represents the despair of this conflict, represents the two facets of the Palestinian tragedy. On the one hand, the tragedy of a shattered people, a people scattered in a diaspora, one part of this people under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, another part of this people one could call under Hamas occupation, and yet another part, citizens of Israel, but really a kind of uncertain identity. Many Palestinian citizens of Israel call themselves Palestinian Israelis, and one is hard-pressed to imagine a more difficult identity to navigate than that. So on the one hand, Gaza represents the profound tragedy of the Palestinian people. On the other hand, Gaza also represents the self-imposed nature of much of this tragedy. In the year 2005, there was, for the first time, a genuine Palestinian opportunity to govern themselves, to prove what the nature of a future Palestinian state might look like if we then proceeded to withdraw from the West Bank. Some of you may recall that Ehud Olmert, who was elected in 2006, immediately after the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, ran on a platform that promised a continuation of the unilateral withdrawal in the absence of a credible peace partner on the other side. Israel would continue to unilaterally withdraw from the West Bank as well. And then the missiles began falling, this time not on the Gaza settlements, which no longer existed, but precisely as the critics of the unilateral withdrawal had warned, falling on Israeli cities and towns across the international border. And what the Israeli public learned was that the conflict is not about 1967, but about 1948, which is to say it is not about the consequences of the Six-Day War, but the consequences of 1948, of the founding of Israel. That remains the crux of the conflict, Israel in any borders. The final outermost siege is the growing isolation of Israel in the international community, most represented by the boycott and divestment movement, but more broadly represented by a growing tendency to criminalize the Jewish state. And I would propose a shift in our language. The terminology that we've been using over these years, really since the year 2000, when the criminalization of Israel began in earnest, the language that has been popular in the Jewish world is the demonization of Israel. That has not taken hold in the general public. I would propose instead that we speak of the criminalization of the Jewish state, because that, in fact, is the process that we are witnessing today. In this outer circle of siege, we find ourselves speaking increasingly a different moral language from much of the international community. We find ourselves almost speaking a moral language that is unintelligible to much of the world, and in reverse, we simply no longer understand the moral sensibilities of much of the international community. We are incredulous that in the war between Hamas and the State of Israel, Hamas seems to be winning, seems to be gaining the upper hand for the hearts and minds of much of humanity. What to us seems so self-evident appears to our critics as either irrelevant or hypocritical. We say no army in the world would exercise the restraint and the care given the difficult conditions of fighting terrorists embedded among a civilian population as the IDF. We say no other country in the world would tolerate missile attacks on our cities. We waited a full week of non-stop missile attacks before launching the airstrikes in this war, and then we waited further before actually sending the ground troops in. We say, we tried to remind the international community that the siege that is imposed on Gaza, which is often invoked, and I saw this in a column in the Sydney Herald the other day, the siege is invoked as somehow offering legitimacy to Hamas attacking Israeli population centers, and we tried to remind the international community that, wait a minute, we withdrew from Gaza, and we did not impose a siege immediately. The siege was imposed when the rockets continued to fly over the international border. The siege was imposed when Hamas violently seized power in Gaza. And yet, most or much of the international community appears indifferent or contemptuous of our arguments. One can look at this conflict in Gaza in one of two ways. This is either a war of defense for Israel against extremist Islamism ranging from Hamas, this time Hamas, in the past and perhaps in the future, Hezbollah, and lurking behind all of them, Iran. Or one can look at this conflict as Israel's war of aggression against the Palestinian people. For most of us, for most Israelis, the overwhelming number of Israelis, and for most of world Jewry, we see this as a war of self-defense. We see this as the most just war that Israel could possibly be fighting. And yet, much of the international community sees this in a very different way. And we are tongue-tied. We don't know what arguments to use anymore, what to say to convince the critics that this is, in fact, the most just kind of war that Israel or any country could possibly be fighting. This war, in a more profound way, is testing some of the most basic premises of Zionism. It is testing the promises that Zionism made to the Jewish people. And Zionism made several great promises to the Jewish people over the course of the last century. First of all, of course, Zionism promised to restore Jewish sovereignty in our land. It promised to teach the Jews how to defend themselves, and those promises have been more than fulfilled. And so, as heavy as our hearts are, despite all the criticism, the fact that we have continued, we have persisted in defending ourselves, we have defied much of the international community, and personally, I hope we will continue to defy the pressure now from the UN and even from President Obama. I hope we will continue to defy that pressure to ensure that we really are protecting ourselves, not only from the rockets, but from the tunnels, and that we don't, please, let's not applaud, because I think the issues are too serious. And I may be saying certain things that some of you may disagree with in the course of the talk as well. So really just to keep ourselves focused on the issues. And in terms of fulfilling the promise that Zionism made to the Jewish people, it has done that and more. Zionism, though, made one other, more problematic promise to the Jewish people, and we tend to forget this other promise, and that was to end anti-Semitism. In 1882, a Russian doctor named Leon Pinsker published a pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation, which galvanized much of the Jewish world before Theodor Herzl's Jewish state. Pinsker, being a doctor, offered a diagnosis of anti-Semitism. He treated anti-Semitism as an illness. And he asked the very sensible question, and Dr. Pinsker was a rational man, a man of the 19th century Enlightenment, and he asked his readers to ponder the question of why the Jews are almost universally hated. And he came up with a profoundly moving reason. He said that anti-Semitism is really the fear of ghosts, that the Jews are a ghost people that are haunting the nations. We are the only people that survived from ancient times without a land. We are the only people that defies the laws of history. And humanity relates to the Jews with fear. And anti-Semitism is the expression of the fear of ghosts. That is really one of the most compelling reasons for anti-Semitism that I've ever come across. It has only one flaw. It's wrong. And we now know, especially in these days, that Dr. Pinsker could not have been more wrong in his diagnosis. Because Dr. Pinsker's prescription for curing anti-Semitism was that the Jews would re-concretize themselves, would reestablish themselves as a normal nation among nations in our land, with an army and all of the accoutrements of national sovereignty. And we would therefore help the nations overcome the illness of anti-Semitism, help cure the nations of anti-Semitism by showing them that we're really no different than anyone else. What has happened, of course, in our time is that the reconcretization of the Jewish people in our land has been precisely what has triggered the latest manifestation of anti-Semitism. And in some ways, I think that historians of the future pondering this time might be tempted to cite the renewal of anti-Semitism after the Shoah, one generation after the Shoah, as in some sense as extraordinary, as inexplicable as the Shoah itself. Not only did the state of Israel fail to cure the world of anti-Semitism, but the Shoah has failed to cure the world of anti-Semitism, and more than that, the Shoah has in fact been used now against us as part of the attempt to undermine our legitimacy. And you've all heard that. How can you Jews who experienced persecution turn around and do the same thing to other people? The same thing. What we are experiencing today is an assault on the legitimacy of our story. If I had to define who the Jews are, and you know, in Israel, periodically we have coalition crises. We used to, in the 60s and the 70s. Who is a Jew? And it threatened the stability of governments. My definition for who are the Jews is that we are a story. We are a story that we tell ourselves about who we think we are. For that reason, the central Jewish ritual that unites virtually all Jews, no matter what level of observance, is the Passover Seder, when we retell the story of our origins. What is happening today is that the story is under assault, the most basic legitimacy of the Jewish story, and it is under assault in different ways in different places. In the East, in much of the Muslim world, the very facts of the Jewish story are under dispute. It is commonplace, certainly throughout the Arab world, to deny the most basic facts of Jewish history. There was no ancient Jewish presence in the land of Israel. That is a Zionist myth. There was no temple on the Temple Mount. Yasser Arafat said that to Bill Clinton at Camp David in July 2000. And, of course, the Holocaust is a Zionist myth or a gross exaggeration. In the West, the process works differently, but ultimately no less destructively. There we experience an inversion of Jewish history. We are thieves who have stolen the land, or, as I mentioned a moment ago, we are doing to another people exactly what was done to us. Holocaust inversion. When one looks around today and we see Israeli flags in demonstrations on the streets from Paris to Sydney, where the Star of David is excised and in its place is the swastika, what we are seeing, in fact, is the posthumous victory of the Soviet Union. The notion of Israel as Nazi Germany was invented in Moscow under the Soviet regime. And it emerged in the Soviet media in the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War. The Nazification of Israel and the Jewish people, which is spreading not only today in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, but increasingly in the West, may be the only posthumous victory of the late and unlamented Soviet Union. The criminalization of the Jewish state is having a profound impact on the Israeli public. But it's not the impact that our critics are hoping for. Because Israelis are very strange people. When we're pushed into a corner, we tend not to react well. We tend not to yield. The main beneficiary of the growing criminalization of Israel, politically, is the hard right. When the war began and our foreign minister, Lieberman, called for taking over Gaza and destroying Hamas, it seemed like an almost peripheral voice, almost dissonant somehow from the political discourse. And I personally dismissed it out of hand. The more the chorus against us has grown, the more Israelis are saying, as we say in Hebrew, im kvar az kvar. If we are being accused of being Nazis, when we are risking our soldiers' lives to protect Palestinian civilians, then the thinking goes among increasing number of Israelis, let's go for broke because we have nothing to lose. And I find myself tempted by that same angry response. If one looks at the history of Israel, we see a pattern emerging. When Israel is criminalized, it is the right that tends to benefit. When Israel is accepted in the international community, we see the Israeli public being more open and responsive to the possibility of peace initiatives with our neighbors. In 1975, the settlement movement had a major demonstration at a place called Sebastia. Sebastia was an abandoned Ottoman railway station in the northern West Bank. And this was a time when there was no settlements allowed by the then labor government of Yitzhak Rabin. There was no settlement permitted in the northern West Bank. And the settlement movement was mounting one unsuccessful attempt after another to illegally settle Jews in the area of Sebastia. On Hanukkah 1975, the settlement movement had its breakthrough, and the labor government capitulated, and the first settlement in the northern West Bank was permitted. Now, in the course of my researching this book that I recently published, Like Dreamers, which is a story about a group of paratroopers who fought in the Battle of Jerusalem in 1967. One part of this group becomes leaders of the settlement movement after the war. Another part becomes leaders of the peace movement. I came upon the incident of Sebastia. And I was wondering, what was it that led the labor government in 1975 to do what it had not done until that moment, which is to capitulate to the settlers and allow the first settlement to be built in the Shomron, in the northern West Bank. And I discovered something that should have been obvious, which is 3 weeks before the settlers broke the labor government, the will of the labor government to stop them, the UN voted to equate Zionism with racism, November 9th, 1975. The Israeli public, which until that moment had been largely indifferent and to some extent antagonistic to the settlement movement, suddenly embraced the settlers, or the would-be settlers, as the Israeli, the Zionist response to the UN. That was the moment that broke the will, the ability of the labor government to contain the settlement movement, because the mood in the Israeli public had swung in their direction as a direct result of Israel being criminalized by the UN. Conversely, what led Israel in 1993 to initiate the Oslo process? I would argue that a large part of that motivation came from Israel's changing international circumstances. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, the collapse of the Iron Curtain, Israel finding the international community increasingly hospitable, opening up diplomatic relations for the first time with China, with India, large parts of Africa and other parts of the Third World, reestablishing diplomatic relations with Israel. And so Israelis felt secure, felt that the international community was not a lynch mob, a diplomatic lynch mob against us. When we feel that security, we allow ourselves to take chances for peace. In this current atmosphere, it does not take much to predict that there is very little constituency in Israel today for taking the kind of risks that the international community and the United States are demanding that we take in creating a Palestinian state. Now, the assault that we are under is an attempt to undo the great post-Holocaust Jewish victory. In 1945, the Jewish people faced several options. There was the option of assimilation. Some survivors actually did opt, we know, for assimilation. And in 1945, assimilation might have seemed like a sensible option to many Jews. The other option was Jewish self-ghettoization, the Haredi or the ultra-Orthodox option. And that, too, might have been a tempting option for some Jews in 1945. We are not interested in joining a world that created that. A majority of the world's Jews, though, opted for a third direction, and that was to join the non-Jewish public space as a self-defined Jewish collective. And that strategy took different forms in Israel and for diaspora communities in the West. For Israel, it meant becoming a nation like other nations, hanging our flag among the flags of the UN. For the Jewish communities in the West, it meant entering into the non-Jewish public space of various host societies and becoming part of the public discourse, putting forth a Jewish political agenda, Jewish values, and really trusting the public space of the West, but doing so, again, as self-confident or increasingly self-confident Jewish collectives. This was, to my mind, the most dignified Jewish response to the Shoah, to the response to the Nazi attempt to exclude us from humanity. And our response was, we will join humanity, but as Jews. That victory, the victory of our ability to establish our presence in non-Jewish public space, to establish Jewish power, our ability to defend ourselves militarily and politically, that is what is now under assault by the movement known as BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. It is an attempt to re-ghettoize the Jewish people, to deny our place in the public space, and you certainly are experiencing that here in Australia, as are other diasporas around the world. We have no right to defend ourselves. We have no right to political power. The question then is, how do we respond? And I'd like to suggest a few possibilities. The first is absolutely no compromise with BDS. There should be no place in the Jewish community for those Jews who support BDS in its various forms. Yesterday, I was watching the news here, and I saw the anti-Israel demonstration, and of course, a Jewish speaker, I don't remember his name, I don't really want to know his name, was featured on the news. And that's an old and dirty stick that has been used against the Jews for many centuries. The good Jew who steps out of the communal framework and damns all the other Jews. In the United States, there are anti-Zionist Jewish organizations, still small but growing, and the Jewish community is engaged in a vigorous debate about whether members or leaders of those organizations should be allowed into the public space, should be even given platforms at the Hillels, on universities, and other Jewish venues. And I would argue vehemently for denying pro-BDS Jews any place in our official communal structure. I fear that we are in what might be called a New Testament moment. And by that I mean that moment when an internal Jewish dispute that we experienced 2,000 years ago between the followers of Jesus and his opponents, who all, of course, were Jews. The moment when that dispute moved from being an internal family argument to becoming an argument from one external religion against Judaism and the Jewish people. And then the language that Jews use routinely in our communal disputes, which is not necessarily the most polite language or the most respectful, mutually respectful language, that which is somehow tolerable within a Jewish context, when it is removed from a Jewish context, it becomes the language of hatred and contempt. And I fear that something similar might be happening today in the Jewish debate over Israel. The second position that I'd like to suggest is that we view, when we assess our communal agenda, and we try to weigh what should be our responses to various issues, we place the question of Israel's isolation, the criminalization of the Jewish people, at the center of Jewish policymaking, and we weigh our decisions according to their impact on the isolation of Israel and the Jewish people. That means, for example, that when the government of Israel weighs the possibility of expanding building in settlements, it will seriously consider the impact on the isolation of Israel, and it will think twice and three times before awarding a gift to those who are seeking to criminalize the Jewish people. It means as well that we pursue a vigorous debate within the Jewish community with those parts of the Haredi world that view the isolation of the Jewish people as our natural condition, that view isolation as a theological expression of a people that is meant to be apart. A majority of the Jewish people does not want to be living in radical separation from the rest of the world, and we need to begin a serious argument on various levels, political, theological, with the Haredi world, the growing Haredi world, and I mean this especially in Israel, where I see the rise of Haredi power as a long-term threat to our ability to defend ourselves from the movement to isolate and criminalize us. In confronting the phenomenon of the criminalization of Israel, I would suggest that we begin a two-track Jewish conversation. One external or aimed externally, and the other directed internally among ourselves. The external conversation is very straightforward, and that is to say to those seeking to criminalize us, how dare you? We will not acquiesce in the return of a situation where the Jewish people becomes the world's symbol of evil, because that is really what the criminalization of Israel is aiming for. Not in this world, and certainly not in the Middle East. And we have every right to ask the media and the international community that is maintaining a very faithful body count of the daily casualties in Gaza. We have the right to ask them whether that daily casualty rate will attain prominence in the media after the Gaza war, but this time in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. In our internal Jewish conversation, I'm not interested in what Syria does, or Iraq does, or even what our critics say and do. In our internal Jewish conversation, I'm interested in the moral health of the Jewish people. And there we need to ask ourselves hard questions. Questions that I don't personally know the answer to, but questions, for example, like, is it necessary, in order for us to attain our military goals in Gaza, to bomb the homes of Hamas leaders? Now, I'm not asking this question rhetorically. It is, for me, a real question. I can see, on the one hand, value, certainly psychological value. On the other hand, a large number of civilian casualties have resulted from those actions. We need the courage to ask ourselves those questions, despite the criminalization of Israel. We need to face the hard reality that the longer this conflict persists, the more certain elements within Israeli society are being morally coarsened. Just a few weeks ago, we were appalled by the burning alive of a 16-year-old Palestinian boy grabbed off the streets of the neighborhood adjacent to my neighborhood in Jerusalem. And what that incident should tell us is that we can no longer use a phrase that Jews always cherished. And that phrase was, Jews don't do, and you can fill in the blank. In my parents' generation, the phrase was, Jews don't beat their wives. Jews don't drink. Well, we know that that's not exactly the case anymore. We also know now, if you would have asked yourself a few weeks ago, would Jews be capable of that atrocity that happened in Jerusalem a few weeks ago? I think our answer would have been absolutely not. So the red line of what some Jews are capable of doing has now essentially been erased. Now, I understand the difficulty of making this distinction between an external conversation and an internal conversation, because to some extent that distinction is artificial. In today's social media age, there really is no private, internal Jewish conversation. All of our conversations are amplified. The world is listening in. Nevertheless, for our own integrity, and despite the usages in which our own self-examination might be negatively applied, we need to maintain that conversation. What often happens in Jewish life is that our left and our right confuse the internal and external conversations. When we try to have an internal, serious moral conversation about what is happening to us as a people, we hear right-wing voices trying to stifle that conversation by saying, look at what they're doing in Syria. And again, when I am having that internal self-reckoning, I'm not interested in knowing what Bashar Assad is doing to his people. It has no relevance to me. The left often commits the opposite mistake, which is it treats hostile international arenas like the UN, human rights NGOs, as arenas that are worthy of Jewish angst. Those are not the arenas in which we should be having our internal moral struggles. And so we need some wisdom in navigating our external conversation and our internal. The next piece of this is that we need to maintain complexity. We need to be able to understand the full complexity of Israel's dilemmas. It's tempting to say, and today one of Israel's leading writers published an op-ed in the New York Times, David Grossman, saying we need to end the occupation. And that's so tempting. If only we end the occupation, but there is no quick fix. Most Israelis today are no longer right-wing, no longer left-wing, but a mixture of both. Most Israelis have internalized the left-right split, so that left and right are now arguing within each of us. Polls show that upwards of 70% of Israelis today define themselves in effect as what one could call a centrist position, which sees a Palestinian state as an existential necessity, just as the left has argued, freeing us from the impossible choice between Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, freeing us from the demographic threat, freeing us from the moral burden of passing occupation on from one generation of father to son. And on the other hand, that same 70% of Israelis sees a Palestinian state as not only an existential necessity for Israel, but as an existential threat. A threat that risks turning our major population centers into the town of Sderot on the Gaza border, which received thousands of missiles over the years. A centrist Israeli has two nightmares about a Palestinian state. One is that there will not be a Palestinian state and the status quo will continue. And the other one, can you help me out on this one? The other one is that there will be a Palestinian state. That's where most of us are today. We are stalemated against ourselves. We need to become multidimensional Jews, capable of holding opposing insights about our condition, and not having to artificially choose between, well, the left's position on occupation and the right's position on a false peace process. Most Israelis today have embraced the insights of the left and the insights of the right. And finally, I would say that we need to maintain our faith. Now, faith for Jews in our time is a tricky business. My father was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, and I understand that here in Sydney that is a positive thing to be from Hungary. My father, as a result of the Shoah, in the years immediately after the Shoah, walked away from Judaism. And it was a very particular Jewish rebellion against God, because he didn't say he doesn't believe in God. He said God no longer deserves Jewish prayer. After the Six-Day War, my father, with the magnanimity of the victor, decided that he could forgive God. And he, in fact, became, in his last years, a deeply devout and believing Jew. And what my father believed, and he has passed this belief on to me, is that the story of Israel is rationally impossible. It is simply an inexplicable story. And the longer, I believe, the longer that we move away from the founding of Israel, the more future generations of Jews will simply not believe that this really happened. For me, as a religious Jew, as a believing Jew, I see the hand of God in history. I believe that there is a plan for humanity, that we are not simply here randomly, and that the Jewish people has some key role to play in the unfolding of whatever that plan is. And that our return home is, in some sense, a fulfillment of the fantasy that Jews held for so many thousands of years, and was more or less the way Jews believed things would turn out in Jewish history, more or less. But whatever one's faith is, whatever the nature of one's faith is, I think all of us share a faith in Netzach Yisrael, in the eternity of the Jewish people. The soldiers who go off to war to defend Israel, who leave their families, we have many reservists in this war fighting in Gaza, leave young fathers leaving their families, are all in their way expressing their faith in the story of Israel and the Jewish story, that this is a worthy story, a story that is worthy of defending and, if necessary, sacrificing for. To stand with Israel today in the diaspora also requires faith and courage. And no diaspora community has showed more faith and courage and loyalty in defending Israel and standing with Israel than the Australian Jewish community. And I'm proud to be here with you tonight, and thank you for all you do.
It's a bit like the Merv Griffin show.
Oh, I see there's water here. Great. So,
That was great.
thank you. Thank you.
Well, Yossi Klein Halevi, you've painted an extraordinarily complex but also rather bleak picture. I'll allow you to take your glass of water. Just go ahead.
Would you like some?
No, I'm fine, thanks. It's a picture of Israel's growing international isolation, internal schism, moral coarsening as a result of war and continual conflict. Is there any good news? Is there any bright side that you can point us to?
Yeah, I mean, Peter, I would take exception with just one point that you just cited, which is growing internal schism. I think that, in fact, the opposite has happened in Israel. Since the year 2000, we've seen, I think, a maturing of the Israeli public. And the emergence of this new centrist majority is very much an expression of that. Because for the first time, we are not bitterly divided anymore between two implacable ideological camps. So at least internally, and this is a message that I feel very, very strongly motivated to convey to diaspora communities, that the old image of Israel as being divided between an ideological left, between Peace Now and the settlement movement and their supporters, is really an outmoded way of looking at Israel. The fact that we've internalized, many of us, the left-right divide, means that we've really learned how to pay attention to the arguments on both sides rather than instinctively choosing an ideological position.
So the good news is at least our woes and our troubles and our isolation has, if anything, united us.
In some ways, yes.
Okay. I want to turn to your book, Like Dreamers, where you explore the way in which the noble secular ideals and dreams that spurred the original Jewish pioneers of Zionism to do great things, and later the religious ideas that inspire the settler movement, have ultimately been shown to be mere illusions. Most Israelis now accept, I think as you said, that there needs to be a solution with the Palestinians based on the principle of two states for two peoples, but don't believe it's possible. Is the belief that such a solution is possible also an illusion in your view?
The belief that a solution is possible now or any time in the near future is a profound illusion, and very few Israelis are in the grips of that illusion. And if John Kerry had bothered asking virtually any Israeli going into the Machane Yehuda marketplace, anyone, does this have a chance of working, he would have saved himself a lot of aggravation. So for the foreseeable future, there is no chance. But we remember Anwar Sadat getting off the plane in Tel Aviv, and we remember that Menachem Begin, the most right-wing prime minister in the history of Israel until that moment, was standing on the tarmac greeting him. And what we now take for granted as the Egyptian-Israeli treaty, as problematic as that treaty is, it is nevertheless held for nearly 40 years. And that, I think, is an indication that one can never say anything definitive in the Middle East. And I see the possibility of shifting alliances happening in the region. The rise of Iran is creating opportunities for Israel. I think there's a certain irony that we've witnessed in the last weeks, which is that Egypt and maybe Saudi Arabia and maybe Jordan have been closer to the Israeli position on Hamas than the American administration. So I don't know really where or how this radically shifting region is going to play out, but we should not foreclose any options.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that for the moment a two-state solution is an illusion, yes, but maybe not in the long term.
That's right.
Whereas the alternatives, a one-state, a unitary state, for example, or a binational state, which were the alternatives considered by the United Nations in 1947 and which have recently been dusted off by some critics of Israel as an alternative to a Jewish state. What would you say to those? Are they even more of an illusion?
Oh, that's an illusion that would lead to an apocalyptic reality. And I don't think it's a coincidence that what we're seeing emerging in the Jewish people is a far left and a far right that are converging on a one-state solution. And these are the elements within the Jewish people that always have a solution. Whatever our problem is, it's either on the far right, we either need to exercise unlimited force, or on the far left, we need to give unlimited concessions. Those are the instinctive responses of these two camps. And now they're finding common ground on the most dangerous solution of all, which is, as a solution, it is a solution of the destruction of Israel.
And yet the incoming president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, is reportedly a believer in a one-state solution.
Well, I'll say in Ruby Rivlin's defense that he has promised to be on his best behavior and not to promote his fantasy solution.
Okay. One final question before I open it up to the audience. Many of us watch the TV coverage of the events in Gaza with a growing sense of despair and depression, and I think you alluded to that in your talk. We are especially outraged by the portrayal, we saw it in the Sydney Morning Herald this last weekend, the portrayal of Israel as intentionally or recklessly killing Palestinian civilians, and even a cartoon that very clearly imputed that to the whole Jewish people. Where does all this land? I mean, is it really our lot, as the Haredim say, to be isolated in the minds of the wider world, or is there some way that we can find a modus vivendi?
I think that this is a pattern that really began in earnest in 1982 with Israel's first Lebanon war. And what changed beginning in 1982 is that we began to fight asymmetrical wars. And every war that Israel has fought since 1982 has been an asymmetrical war in which we send our conventional army to confront terrorists who are embedded in a civilian population, which means that the very nature of our wars now lead to an erosion of Israel's standing in the world. And this is the reason why Netanyahu waited a full week before responding to the missile war, because we knew exactly what was going to happen. We would go, as soon as you send the army in, sooner or later there's going to be some inadvertent, accidental atrocity which will galvanize the media. And then you've lost. And this is a pattern that has been repeated in every war since 1982. Now, this has a cumulative effect. And we are seeing a serious erosion in our standing that doesn't just begin today. It began, I think, really in 1982, continuing into the first Intifada of the late 80s and onward. Now, it's true that I don't think there's another country in the world that has as many people who actively hate it as the State of Israel. On the other hand, this is something that Netanyahu said recently. There is probably no other country in the world that has so many friends who actively love it. And there is a struggle that is going on, and we have by no means lost this struggle. And I think that what we are seeing here in Australia is really is this struggle playing out in very dramatic form. You have one of the world's most pro-Israel governments, and it's really an extraordinary achievement of all the work that you've done over these years. And that deserves applause. Please applaud yourselves.
Thank you.
And on the other hand, we are seeing the rise of a pathological streak of blatant anti-Semitism, not only on the part of some elements in the Muslim community, and let's emphasize some elements. I understand that you have more than 5,000 Muslims here in Sydney, and that's the number that was at the demonstration recently. You have considerably more than 5,000, close to 500,000. And not all the people, from what I could see on the news last night at that demonstration, were Muslim. So there is a struggle going on now, and I have full confidence in your ability to continue to fight and prevail. And I have confidence in our ability as well. Just one last point was, if you look at the way Israel is fighting the information war this time, there is no comparison to previous wars. The IDF has really gotten itself together, and it's an extraordinarily impressive level of information, very sophisticated, that's been coming out. There are those who will listen and there are those who won't. We will continue to make our case.
Okay, look, I know that there are many in the audience who are brimming over with questions and who would like to put them to you. So, can I have a show of hands, please? I think it's Linda. Yes, even with my poor eyesight, I can make out Linda in the far corner. Now, we only have, I should emphasise, we only have about 5 or 10 minutes at the most for questions, so please keep them succinct.
Thank you so much for a very invigorating discussion, and I learned a tremendous amount from what you said. One thing confused me, though, and that was, if we exclude those Jews who would promote BDS in any form from our internal conversation, doesn't that prevent that conversation from being an authentic conversation?
I think it's a really good question. And look, I think that when I say exclusion, I mean, first of all, excluding from positions of authority in the Jewish community, positions of responsibility. I personally would not exclude individuals who are turning away from Israel, but it would be very difficult to include in our conversation those Jews who are actively encouraging the criminalization of Israel. I think that once you've crossed that line, you know, I would actually make a distinction. I would go to the Haredi community for a certain distinction here, and that is Satmar versus Neturei Karta. Satmar is as many of you know, certainly the Hungarians among us, Satmar is a very large Hungarian anti-Zionist Hasidic group. It has not made common cause with the enemies of Israel. Neturei Karta has linked up with Hezbollah. You can see them on the streets. I think they were here as well the other day, and the 2 or 3 of them at the demonstration. They were at the Holocaust Denial Conference in Tehran a few years ago. I personally would not only would I exclude Neturei Karta from the Jewish community, I would not participate in a minyan. I wouldn't pray with Nature Karta. And I feel the same way about the BDSers on the left.
In the very far corner.
Yossi, I just want, my name is Eran Weiner, and I just like to go back on a couple of comments that you mentioned. One is the siege, the tightening of the siege. Now, a siege is from within, and a siege, of course, is external. Then you're quoting Pinsker. Now, Pinsker and A.D. Gordon have said that when they're living in Israel or in Palestine at the time, before the commemoration of the State of Israel, they were referring to the Jewish settlements as such as the experimental in Jewish life. And Herzl also said so in Judenstaat. He said, we need to proceed with this experiment. So much so that Lord Balfour, when he inaugurated the Jewish university, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, he also referred to it as an experiment, this great experiment in Jewish life and existence. Now, if we're talking about siege, the anti-Semitism that we see now on television, we hear on the radio, we read in the newspapers, I suggest that they derive from actually anti-Zionism. Now, how does that equate with the siege? The siege, the internal siege in Israel, where we don't have a resolution in the Knesset, few people, maybe a handful of people, with one vote can hold the balance of power, or they do hold the balance of power, and the country, in fact, feels like that they're going nowhere.
I think we understand your question.
At
least I hope so.
I don't understand the question. Could you explain it?
If I understand your question correctly, you're talking about the internal siege within Israel based on the external perceptions that are imposed on it by the rest of the world.
Take it as a comment.
All right, happy to move on. Anyone else? Right down the very...
With respect to your insight about the internal and the external conversations we should be having, could you give your comment on this mantra that everything we do is illegal under international law, despite the fact that we had an outstanding professor of international law here, the late Professor Stone, who said that it isn't illegal, settlements, for example, or Jerusalem, and the French High Court of Justice ruled that the settlements are illegal under international law in a 20-page document, but the professor of law in Jerusalem says it's illegal, and the NIS says illegal. How does that fit into your internal and external conversation?
Look, my starting point about the settlements is that they are not just understandable from a perspective of Jewish history, but in some sense they were inevitable. I think that after the Six-Day War, we needed to have one part of the Jewish people that would test the premises of a peace process, and another part of the Jewish people that would test the premise of returning to those parts of the land that we longed for 2,000 years. I don't see the settlements as illegitimate. The settlements are a profound expression of the most legitimate longing for the land. The question is whether the settlements are wise. That's a very different question. It's not a question of legitimacy. It's a question of wisdom. And if expanding the settlements at a time of growing isolation for Israel becomes the red flag, becomes the pretext for legitimizing that isolation of Israel, then I have to ask myself, whatever gains we could possibly get from the settlements, and I increasingly question, as a majority of Israelis do today, the gains of expanding settlements. But certainly in this context, settlements become a profound disservice and an impediment in our ability to establish our international legitimacy. And there I feel it is, from my point of view, it is a self-evident need for the Israeli government to exercise deep restraint.
Okay, one last question from the centre of the room, because I've taken them from both extremes. Gillian. I will repeat the question.
Hold on.
Oh, no, we're getting a mic. Great.
Could I just ask you a question about a recent Israeli article that noted that the discovery of all these tunnels really caught the IDF napping? Your last point was that they are doing well in the media, better than they used to, etc. Without even challenging that, could I have your views on why they were caught napping, if you think they were, why the tunnels were not discovered earlier, and why they are finding themselves really on the back foot, having to deal with the tunnels?
That is a crucial question. Every one of Israel's wars, beginning with Yom Kippur 1973, has ended with an officially appointed commission of inquiry, looking into the failures of the previous war. We had the Agranat Commission in Yom Kippur, we had the Khan Commission in 1982, we had the Reunited Commission in Lebanon too in 2006, and my strong sense is that the next commission of inquiry is on its way. And this question of the tunnels will be one of the central issues that will be on the table, because the Israeli public is going to be demanding some hard answers.
Yossi Klein Halevi, it's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that there are dozens more questions waiting for you out there, but regrettably, our time is limited.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a wonderful, wonderful performance. Thank you.